Hi everyone. In this module, we're talking about working with existing data that we have at our disposal. And I start off with this image. I love data. And when I think about working with existing data, I think about one of the issues that we have is that and why I wanted to make sure that we talked about working with existing data is we get really caught up in collecting data. And we want every piece of information that we can possibly get our hands on, and sometimes we get a little bit overzealous in our data collection efforts. And one of the ways where we engage in this zealousness toward data collection is through the overuse of surveys. And I think about how often students receive email requests to complete surveys from one office or another, or maybe they all come centrally from a division of student affairs, but they're all asking oftentimes very similar things, but from perspectives of different offices. And maybe we start off with pushing out some surveys and we get a decent response rate, but then as a semester or an academic year trudges along, our response rate dwindles pretty significantly. In fact, we start to see a really significant drop off after a couple of surveys if we're doing them pretty frequently. And by pretty frequently, I mean at least one a month. I've seen campuses where students are receiving email requests to complete surveys at least once a week. So we need to be careful about how much data we're collecting, because one of the things that we see, particularly from the perspective of this constant onslaught of survey requests, is that we end up gathering all this information and we don't actually do anything with it. And this has to stop. It's not that I'm anti-survey, but we need to make sure that we're using data that we get, and that when we request information from students or from other stakeholders through surveys or even other data collection means, that we're analyzing it in a timely manner. So what do we do? Well, we need to identify the sources of data that we have within our departments and within our divisions. So do we have survey data that we're sitting on? Do we have survey data that maybe we did a very cursory analysis of just to get something done? Is it something that we can go back and look at and analyze at different levels? Can we really dig in and figure out what we can really learn from that survey data that we have? Do we have participation or usage data? Think about if you go to, let's say, a campus recreation center. On many campuses, in order to get past the front desk, you have to swipe your ID card, whether you're faculty, student, staff, or visitor. So we have ID card swipes, so we know who's entering and when and how often they come. Sometimes we may even know how often they stay. We may ask for a swipe to exit. That's not as common, but it's something that's out there. Also, there are some institutions that have proximity chips in the ID cards. They're embedded in the cards. So it's not like the little chip that's in your debit or credit card now that you slip into a reader at a cash register, but it's actually embedded in between the layers of plastic. One, it can't be dug out, and most people don't even know it's there. When I was at the University of South Carolina, we were actually transitioning to using proximity readers in our access control system within the residence halls, and there was discussion at that time. This was in the year around 2001. There's discussion of that time of where else could we use prox readers in order to get a sense of how many people are in a room, how often does a particular space get utilized, how long do people stay, things like that. That's really important information, and so one of the things in terms of identifying sources of data is finding out what types of data are we collecting about our spaces and about usage of different facilities or different resources on campus. Another source of data is our student profile data set. This is generally maintained by a registrar's office or a records office, depending on the naming of an individual on an individual campus. But think about what's there. It's not just a student's name and ID number. We There's a lot of information. And so I think about from let's look at enrollment management as a unit on a campus. And one of the aspects housed within enrollment management is the admissions function, but also the recruitment function, and those are often the same thing. But some institutions look at recruitment as one piece, and then the admissions is the actual getting people to enroll part, to apply and then enroll. So we might use that student profile data to help us see where are our recruiting efforts having the most impact. And this is information, this is a process that most institutions are going to employ if they have full-time recruiters on staff or even part-time recruiters on staff. Because they want to make sure that if we are sending recruiters pretty regularly to Henderson, Kentucky, are we getting a yield from those trips? And so that's a really basic look at student profile data and how we might use it. Other units might look at it as well. Before I arrived at LSU, a person who's now the associate vice president for student life he did analysis of a lot of data of the institution and used that data to propose that there be a first year experience unit created. And part of that unit would be responsible for coordinating programs, services, and events for out-of-state students and also for transfer students. And so this person's name is Dr. Darrell Ray. He looked at this data and this information, and they still do this 10 years later from that initial effort. Where are students coming from, but also where are we seeing some and using student profile data combined with student academic records, are we seeing some consistent patterns of are our transfer students struggling in particular courses or sets of courses? Are out-of-state students demonstrating academic concerns, things like that? Also working with folks in residence life and other areas who hopefully are tracking when students are expressing concerns, tracking on some level. Let's say I work in a residence hall and I have 7 RAs, and 4 of those 7 are expressing that they're students who are from out of state, particularly states that are a greater distance from the campus, are expressing more concerns about fitting in at the institution and being able to perform at the level expected. And that's all information. It's existing data. It's seeing that we have the student profile data, looking at academic performance, maybe reaching out to residence life and asking those questions. Another source of existing data might be our policies or our manuals and our handbooks. This is an important process that I think we sometimes forget about in assessment work. We get so caught up a lot of times in thinking about analyzing survey results and running statistical tests, but we also need to pay attention to this textual data that can really tell us a lot about our institution and our students' experiences. And the same thing goes with meeting minutes. As university committees and departments hold meetings, more and more there are increased expectations to document what takes place in those meetings through the taking of minutes. And so those can be a powerful source of data to examine. And then finally, the last piece I have on this slide, institutional studies. Institutional studies might be something like the National Survey of Student Engagement, which is also known as the NSSE, which is coordinated out of Indiana University. And there are other studies as well. And when we participate in that, and we do that every other year, at Murray State, and we get information back. We get our data back from NESE, the NESE office at Indiana University. And we're able to get a sense of students' perspectives on engagement. And if I remember correctly, I want to say NESE looks at students who are in their first year versus students who are classified as seniors. And so these are really important pieces of information that we need to think about in terms of identifying existing sources of data and working with them. So we've got data and we've got more data at our disposal. That's great. But what else could we be doing? Or what else should we be considering? Well, there's some ethical considerations, and we address ethics separately in this course, but I want to make sure that I mention a couple or a few ethical considerations when it comes to working with existing data. One of the things that we need to really keep in mind is the idea of veracity, that we are working with data in an honest way. We're not trying to manipulate things to fit some other purpose than what the data actually represents. I mentioned it previously when it comes to administering surveys, but we want to make sure that we're working with data that is timely. We don't want to pull data that is outdated unless it serves a particular purpose. If we say, oh, look, we've got all this data and it's from 10 years ago, that's great. If we're looking at a longitudinal study, we're comparing year to year, looking at trend data, looking to see how things have changed over that 10-year period. But if we're just pulling data from 10 years ago because we found it, analyzing it, and then reporting on it, and it almost gets there's likely going to be an assumption that it's current data. That's an ethical concern for me. And we need to make sure that we're respectful of the data, because the data that we're working with represents people. And even if it's policies, remember, one of the reasons that we want to look at policies is because we want to make sure that our policies are equitable. We want to make sure that our policies are fair and just. And so our policies reflect people as well. So there's got to be an easy button that we can press to work with this existing data, right? Well, probably not. So we've got this data. There's no easy button. What do we do? Sometimes it can, wading through existing data can almost be like looking at the screen of code on the Matrix movies. It can be time consuming, and sometimes it can make us feel as though we're on Hoarder's Data Edition. Sometimes these mounds of data, and it's not necessarily physical mounds, hopefully it's not those binders sitting on shelves, but sometimes the idea that, wow, we've got all this data at our disposal, or I've just discovered this treasure trove of data, what do? I don't have time to do this in my normal day as it is. How am I going to wade through all of this data that we have? Well, we need to organize it. And so one of the tools that is available that I've used to plan data studies or plan studies and data collection, but also that I've encouraged folks to think about using when it comes to working through their backlog of data, rather than calling it a data hoard. I think that can have a negative connotation for a lot of folks and make them maybe feel guilty and then shut down in the process. But let's think about our data backlog instead. We need to organize it. So first, what's a question that we need to answer? Why do we need to answer that question? So if we have some sort of question about an issue within our unit or our division, hopefully the why for that relates back to institutional mission, the strategic plan, budgetary concerns. You kind of those big three pieces that typically we want to see assessment working toward. Then what kind of data will answer the question? And then if we have it, do we have any existing data? If yes, where? And it's not necessarily do I have on my computer or within my access in my gate or some other system, but is it okay? I bet we have this data on campus. Who do I need to talk to? So if I know that there's something that I want, I've got a curiosity, or I say I'm sure that we've got this data, and I've got a burning question, and it'll help us. So for example, one of the issues that I've seen at Murray State since I've been here is we have an increased focus and or not necessarily focus, but increased interest in offering online courses. We've charged this additional fee for web-based courses. And so I was curious is has there been growth in the number of enrollments in online courses? Because one of my concerns is we need to provide more training for faculty when it comes to online teaching and helping faculty understand some of the key considerations for online learning. And so I reached out to folks in the registrar's office, and they got me some basic information about online courses. I didn't have that at my disposal, but I knew that it was available, or I had a really good sense it would be available at the institution. And so then going from another perspective, maybe we are the holders of data and we need to start organizing it for ourselves and for use by others. So what are the data sources? As we identify that we have these sets of data, what questions can each piece of data or data set answer? And then what forms of data or types of variables are represented? So think back to ADM 630 when we talked about different forms of data in terms of ordinal or categorical or nominal. What's represented there, because that ultimately will help us when it comes to analyzing our data. And when it comes to analysis, we want to make sure that we match our analysis to the question that we're trying to answer. So if our question is really about who are the users of a particular space or a particular experience, where who are those people? What do they represent? What demographic categories do they represent? That's all descriptive statistics. So I wouldn't want to waste my time setting up some regression analysis when that's really not the question I'm trying to answer. But I don't want to stop short with only looking at those descriptive statistics if there's more that I want to explore, if I think there's some value or there's a question to be answered looking at differences across groups or something like that. So maybe I might do an analysis of variance across demographic groups or across in-state versus out-of-state or within 18 county service region, out of 18 county service region, things like that. So another perspective is then, and you see each of these, at least the way I've conceptualized these tables, is each one actually feeds so one table feeds the next table. So we've got our data source, we've got a sense of the questions it can answer, the sense of the data type represented, and the variables, the types of variables represented, and then we need to have a plan. What's the analysis that's going to answer the question? And for me, as I engage in research and I've done assessment work in the past and kind of help folks think through their assessment efforts as well, it's really important to write out and plan out what you need to do to answer the question that you have. Because if you're spending your time doing a whole bunch of extra analysis, that's time you could have been spending somewhere else working on another issue. So that's it for working with existing data.